Hello, everyone. This is Claire with ACC Minnesota. Just wanted to say thank you for joining us for tonight's lecture, Devices and Data, Filling the Gap in the Essential 8. And many thanks to Dr. Joe Jensen, who is a cardiology fellow at Hennepin Healthcare and the Minneapolis Heart Institute for tonight's presentation. Before we begin, I'd just like to share a couple upcoming ACC Minnesota events. First up, we will have more FIT lectures on the way, so please keep an eye out for those. And then also this Saturday, we have a Y Cardiology event for trainees interested in pursuing cardiology. It's presented by the Women in Cardiology section of ACC Minnesota. And so you can pre-register online, and I'll post that link in the chat at some point. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our presenter, Dr. Joe Jensen, who will take it from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. Can everybody see my screen okay? As Claire mentioned, I'm Joe Jensen. I'm a third-year cardiology fellow, and I'll be exiting fellowship at the end of June and starting a new practice at Metropolitan Heart and Vascular just outside the Twin Cities in September. Quick disclosure for Dose Health, I'm a co-founder, equity holder, and current board member. And as I came to the end of fellowship, I began to reflect on exactly what brought me to where I am today. And as many of you can relate to, the guidelines have really been my partner through the whole way. And so on the left here, you'll see the most recent hypertension guidelines. And then on the right here, you'll see the most recent diabetes guidelines. And these specific phrases kept popping up: promoting optimal lifestyle habits, intensive lifestyle behavior changes, non-pharmacologic therapy. And these squishy topics were really never covered in medical school and only rarely discussed in residency and beyond. And given these bulky evidence-based guidelines, there's hardly enough time for those, much less these far more squishy topics. So I began to search for exactly what these things meant, and I came across Life's Essential 8 by the American Heart Association. These are what they identify as key measures to a healthy lifestyle. They include healthy eating, increased activity, blood sugar management, weight management, lowering cholesterol, blood pressure management, smoking cessation, and sleep. I do find it ironic that we as cardiologists, primary care doctors, endocrinologists, nephrologists, APPs, we don't have the training to understand these simple yet complex topics ourselves, much less actually having the time to address these for our patients. We are not good at this, nor do we have the time. So who possibly could step in to address these essential 8 measures that impact literally everybody alive? And that, of course, is industry. No way a target market this large and this lucrative could possibly be passed up. So it turns out at this time, 1 in 5 Americans own some sort of smart wearable device or non-wearable device that's also smart. The market is already large with massive growth expected in the coming years. And if you look at this graph here, we were at 15 billion in 2019, and that's expected to grow to $70 billion by the year 2025. That's just a matter of just over 5 years. And so it's our job as care providers to understand what's out there, what it means, and start to think about how we'll integrate this data into our practice and to our own lives. And so using the Essential 8 as a framework, I'm going to give a brief introduction and overview to some of the most commonly and less commonly devices used on the market today. It turns out that these seemingly simple devices are actually backed by both basic science and outcomes data. So without further ado, let's get started. And I will warn you, don't panic as we get through this first section. It's by far the longest section. It'll take me the most time to get through, but it also lays the foundation for every other topic that we'll talk about today. So this infographic here is our framework, and this is the Move More framework, which gives some very basic and helpful advice in this case as to how to move more, setting goals, keep going, walking more, staying active, add it up, and make it a habit. And so why do we as care providers care about this? Well, it turns out that physical activity is inversely correlated to cardiovascular outcomes. So let's take a look at that data. First, I'll start with a meta-analysis of 48 studies that looked at over 2.6 million patients. And they looked at a baseline activity level that they defined as 750 MET-mins. And I don't expect anybody to know what that means, but a MET-min of 1 is when you're at rest. If you're running at 6 miles an hour, that's 10 METs. And so to achieve that 750 Met minute threshold, you're running for 75 minutes a week. I'll let you do the math on how much exercise that requires on a daily basis. 4 miles an hour, 5 Mets, 150 minutes a week, and a slower walk, 2.5 Mets, 300 minutes a week. And this is a graph with a mortality, CVD mortality. This isn't a composite outcome. This isn't a bunch of squishy data. We're looking at CVD mortality, the hazard ratio here with the baseline 750 Met mins here. This graph shows that any activity above that threshold actually led to decreased mortality, and anything less than that 750 Met min led to increased mortality. More activity, less mortality. The ironic thing about this study is that it was originally designed to figure out if there was a threshold of too much activity, actually marathoners and ultra marathoners and Ironman athletes, to see if they were actually at risk, higher risk of cardiovascular disease. More activity, less mortality. Another study of 16,000 women from the Women's Health Study wore an accelerometer for 7 days between 2011 and 2015, and the mean step count per day was 5,500. And you can see here, starting even at 4,500 steps per day, these people were at a reduced risk of mortality. 4,400 steps per day was the threshold. It's a lot less than the publicly known 10,000 steps per day, but it just shows that any sort of activity is going to lead to reduced mortality. So why does this happen? And there are a couple key metrics that I want to take a look at. The first is actually heart rate. And this is, again, 2 million patients from 45 prospective cohort studies. And they looked at the resting heart rate of 70 beats per minute. And you can see here, this is the relative risk for coronary artery disease and for non-cardiovascular disease. If you have a resting heart rate, and that's defined as your heart rate waking up in the morning, of greater than 70, you're at higher risk for both coronary artery disease and non-cardiovascular disease. This more recent study in The Lancet was actually part of the Avabradine study for patients in heart failure. And while that was a negative study, they actually stratified the groups into a heart rate of greater than or less than 70. And you can see the graphs here. Heart rate greater than 70 is in the green, heart rate less than 70 is in the blue dash. And these are important outcomes. Upper left here is CVD death, heart failure admission, MI admission, revascularization. When your heart rate, resting heart rate is above 70, you're at higher risk for all of those things. The other metric that's important in this case is heart rate variability. We're going to bring it all the way back to basic science in medical school and actually in college, thinking about the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system. I'll keep it as simple as I can for cardiology fellow level. Parasympathetic, rest and digest, sympathetic system, fight or flight. These both play into the heart rate variability. And so what is it? And it's actually the physiologic variation in the duration of intervals between sinus beats. And so some of you may be thinking about, well, what about respiratory sinus arrhythmia? So I want to take a quick second. Participation highly encouraged. I'm going to do it, so I think you should do it as well. So I want you to find your pulse, either your carotid or your radial pulse, neck or wrist. Find your pulse there. Mine's probably a little bit faster than yours right now. I want you to take a deep breath in. And then exhale it out. And what'd you notice? Well, I'm gonna break it down for you here. In inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, intrathoracic pressure lowers, atrial pressure lowers, more blood returns to the heart, the atria expand, triggers the baroreceptors, and it suppresses vagal tone, suppresses the parasympathetic tone, so the heart rate increases. Exhalation does the exact opposite, and that's what leads to your heart rate decreasing because the vagal tone is no longer suppressed. So that's just a quick experiment in physiology. Heart rate increases with inspiration and decreases with expiration. That is not heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is defined as the root mean square of differences in successive RR intervals. And that's just a fancy calculation. There are a few different ways to calculate it, which is beyond the scope of this talk. But at the end of the day, higher heart rate variability means higher parasympathetic input. So again, why do we care? And this is a list of studies that looked at heart rate variability and a variety of outcomes. And this is to show that with greater heart rate variability, you have better outcomes. And it turns out heart rate variability isn't just for the sick. You can see elite athletes here. And other studies have shown that daily recordings of HRV are superior at increasing fitness and exercise performance than training based on conventional methods. You wake up in the morning, you have a low heart rate variability. That means you have a low parasympathetic output. And that might mean you might need to take a rest day instead of training hard. Conversely, you wake up with a really strong heart rate variability, high heart rate variability, your body is ready for more strain and you can work out harder that day. So at the end of the day, high heart rate increases hemodynamic stress and shortens the diastolic phase. That's kind of the hypothesis as to why heart rate matters and why greater than 70 puts you at a greater risk for a variety of conditions. And this is actually low heart rate variability is a marker of sympathetic overactivity that leads to an increased VF risk, arrhythmia risk, and insulin resistance. Fortunately, we can combat this as increased activity levels can lead to lower resting heart rate and higher heart rate variability. So let's take a look at the devices that have been used over the years to track this data. The first pedometer, surprisingly, way back in 1760. Fast forward over 100 years and we have the first electrocardiogram. Another 40 years, you'll notice the time frame getting shorter and shorter. We have the first pulse oximeter. Then we have the first MEMS device in 1965, and this is really important. This is a micro electromechanical system that really allowed for the miniaturization of sensors. And then in 2009, Fitbit, kind of the godfather of all these wearable devices, released its first product here, the basic pedometer. And then only 9 years later, Apple releases the first Apple Watch with ECG built in, a single lead ECG. And blowing this up further, you can see just an entire variety of different companies and different devices. Everybody wanted to get into this market. Some of you who were born in the late 80s, early 90s might recognize some of these devices. Some are still available today, but many have fallen by the wayside. I want to highlight this one in particular. This is the Fitbit Flex, which was released in May of 2013, because here I am a year later at my wedding wearing my Fitbit Flex, and who knew that 9 years later I'd still be talking about it today. My wife less happy about the whole Fitbit on our wedding day, but I think it was totally worth it. So here we are 9 years later. So how do these devices work? And I'm just going to blow through this pretty quickly, even though they're quite complex with these micro electromechanical systems. But essentially they work with a triaxial accelerometer and a gyroscope. And the two of these combine to form the 6 degrees of freedom that you can see here. You combine that 6 degrees of freedom with GPS. With 4 satellites, they can pinpoint our position with an accuracy up to 5 meters, just less than 5 meters. And so all of that data is essentially input from the movement sensing, the location sensing, into a variety of proprietary algorithms depending on the specific device that then are trained to understand whether we're sleeping, whether we're working out, specific activities that we're doing. So how do these devices track heart rate and heart rate variability? Well, first, I mentioned the most basic way of doing it, which is pulse oximetry, and that's the ratio of red to infrared light. And photoplethysmography is probably the most important and kind of misunderstood metric, the device that detects blood volume changes in the microvascular bed. And basically all devices use this technique. Even the Apple Watch with a single lead EKG depends on PPG rather than single lead ECG to track heart rate and heart rate variability. And then finally, the ECG tracking of heart rate and heart rate variability can be seen on a few devices, and I've highlighted Apple Watch and AliveCor here. And it's important with any new device that they be tracked against the gold standard. So you can see 3 that I'll be talking about here today: the Apple Watch, the Whoop, and the Aura. And these devices were compared against the gold standard, which in this case is an ECG. And you can see the variability of device minus ECG differences in heart rate. You can see here that all of these correlate quite well, very few outliers above or below 10 beats per minute. And the Whoop clearly has the tightest variation here. And that's kind of important going forward. I'll talk about that. Briefly looking at the devices on the market today, many of you are familiar with the Apple Watch, and the Apple Watch is interesting because it's an upfront cost of $400, but really the value proposition here is the tremendous amount of apps that you can use within the Apple Watch itself. And all of the health data can be compiled into the singular Apple Health app, including the single lead ECG. And I thought that I have this picture up because I'm so fascinated by it every time I give this talk and look at the Apple Watch, and that it's so clever, I think, how they designed this single lead ECG with one lead at the bottom of the backside of the dial and the second lead on the crown. So you're able to connect the left side of your body with the right side of your body by putting your index finger of your opposite hand on the crown to create the single lead ECG. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Fitbit, as I mentioned before, kind of the godfather of these wearable devices. They have a variety of devices through Google and Samsung, with upfront costs in addition to monthly fees, depending on what kind of data you're looking to track. And I also wanted to show this because they have a few devices that are specifically marketed toward children, which is a whole other topic altogether. But I think it's pretty interesting that Fitbit actually chooses to pursue this market and reinforce that physical activity is really important no matter the age. And switching gears to Whoop, a company some of you may not be familiar with, I just want you to notice when we talk about Whoop, when we talk about Aura, the differences in the marketing and the differences in how the website looks. All of these pictures are taken from their websites. And so the mission of Whoop is to unlock human performance. And how they do that here is with a wrist-worn device. And the interesting thing about this particular device is that it can be worn 24/7, 365, because the charger itself actually slips on top of the device. So you can charge it while you're actively wearing it. Many of these devices have similar outputs of data, and Whoop provides a pretty good framework to talk about all of this. And so here you have daily strain, or this is their proprietary algorithm for activity. And in the middle here is how they track sleep and the different stages of sleep. And then finally here you have recovery, which is based on your resting heart rate, your heart rate variability, your sleep, and the strain. And so essentially all of these outputs feed back on each other. And the interesting thing about Whoop, as I mentioned, as I alluded to in that HRV study, is that their device actually helps guide you as to how much physical activity you should have based on your recovery. So if your recovery is poor, your target daily strain is lower. If your recovery is really high, the device is going to encourage you to work out harder, faster, longer. The story of how Whoop really exploded, I think, is very interesting for me personally, and hopefully for all of you too, as it directly relates to the PGA Tour. And this is back in June of 2020, a dark time for all of us without question. And a few months beforehand had gone without any sort of professional sports or entertainment. And golf, being very much a solo sport, was one of the first to attempt to come back from the COVID hiatus. And they had a really stringent testing protocol in place where a PGA tournament typically runs Thursday through Sunday, but there are practice rounds Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday beforehand. And so how the PGA decided to handle this is that players and their caddies would test Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of tournament week, not test Thursday through Sunday, with the assumption that they would be socially isolated, socially distanced, and there weren't any fans as well. And so this player, Nick Watney, passed the protocols Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and woke up Thursday or Friday morning and looked at his Whoop, which he had been wearing, and it showed that his respiratory rate was 2 breaths per minute higher than it had been the last 6 months. It was rock solid the past 6 months. I think it was 14 breaths a minute. Maybe it was 12. Doesn't matter. Woke up one morning with the respiratory rate 2 breaths per minute higher and said, I feel okay, but something's not right. Brought it to the PGA and said, hey, look, I think I should be tested. They said, no, you passed the testing protocols. It's not a big deal. Well, long story longer, he insisted on getting tested. The test turned out positive. He withdrew from the tournament, and a partnership between Whoop and the PGA Tour took off from there. 1 year later, the partnership really skyrocketed, as you'll see Rory McIlroy in May of 2021 with fans back in attendance outside. And Whoop partnered with the PGA Tour to actually put these devices on the athletes and actually broadcast their data live. So here's Rory at the final round, the final hole, with a 2-shot lead in the Wells Fargo Championship, May of 2021. Lower left here, you can see his live heart rate, 125 beats per minute. His shot was less than ideal off the tee, and his heart rate spikes 10 more beats per minute, almost to 140 beats per minute.
2-shot lead, the only thing you can't do is miss it left.
The data continues. His second shot, heart rate still not below 115 beats per minute.
Just right of the flag.
Full swing. A little bit of anticipation as it lands on the green. Heart rate goes up to 135 beats per minute. And finally, the final putt for Rory goes in. He wins the tournament, protects his 2-stroke lead. His heart rate never dropping below 120 beats per minute. pretty spectacular. And I think we can all agree now, if we didn't already, that golf is most certainly a sport. And these men and women, without question, are elite athletes. We'll put it that way. So I want to bring that data back to medicine. And this is a picture of an output that Whoop would give after a workout. And so here you can see heart rate spikes. It's a little bit small, but down here is 100 beats per minute. Here's 150. And here's the time of the workout. It looks like this workout was about 57.5 minutes long, to be precise. 592 calories, average heart rate of 143, max heart rate of 173. Looks like kind of some sort of high intensity interval training here, except it wasn't. This was actually data from a senior resident in the medical ICU as he was taking care of a crashing ICU patient. He was not giving compressions. He was not doing anything physically demanding. This was him just mentally and emotionally managing a sick patient in the ICU. So I think it's pretty eye-opening for us to understand the strain that we can put on our bodies just on our day-to-day basis, depending on our jobs. Whoop in this case is membership based, and depending on the length of time that you commit to the membership, there are different pricing models here. Moving on to Oura, again, notice the differences in the design language and their messaging. And we know that you are the source of your truth. Health starts from understanding you, and great health starts with good sleep. And this is a device that's meant to be worn as a ring on your index finger, although it can work on any finger. The index finger, because that's where the pulse is the most easily distinguished. And Oura started as probably the industry leading sleep tracker, and that's where a lot of their messaging focuses on. And you can see here, it's pretty similar to the Whoop device, and that it'll tell you how long you sleep, the sleep efficiency, restlessness, things like that. And will also give you a measure of recovery. And recently their algorithm was updated to be able to track activity in real time. It used to not be able to do that. Now it can with better battery life in their Generation 2 device. And finally, recovery is obviously very important, as I mentioned before, and this is a readiness score. And again, marketing understand knowing why you feel the way you feel, and then planning your day accordingly. It's going to be a high activity day, maybe not so much, maybe more of a rest day. So this is a $350 device with a $6 a month subscription. A ring sizing kit comes in the mail where all these sizes are available. You can try it on different fingers. You send the testing kit back and a ring will come just a week later. One device that you may all be more familiar with if you've seen this in the clinical setting, this is the one I've most commonly seen, and this is Kardia device by the company AliveCor. There are a few different devices that you've probably seen over the years. This is the Kardia mobile device. This was their original device. That's now $78. And it's a single lead ECG where you put 2 fingers on each side, and it provides a single lead ECG, and it's able to detect atrial fibrillation, bradycardia, tachycardia, normal sinus, PVCs, PACs, and wide QRS. Their new generation device is credit card size for $100. And much like many of these devices, the recurring revenue model is strong in that you can pay on a yearly, monthly basis for extra features, some diagnostics, some expert interpretations from medical doctors. For me, the most intriguing device they offer is the 6-lead device. Again, I think this is just insanely clever how they put together a full 6-lead limb ECG system, where much like their first generation device, you connect your 2 arms here with these silver plates. And then on the back side of the device, kind of similar to the Apple Watch, is another lead. And when you touch that to your lower extremity, you're able to create the 6-lead system. And they actually have a specific clinic interface where this can be a really quick, efficient, and easy way to check a patient in clinic, whether or not they're in sinus rhythm, atrial fibrillation, their PVC burden on the spot, things like that. So I think this is a really cool device. Maybe not necessarily as useful for the home, though it does collect more data since it offers 6 leads, but a pretty cool clinical alternative to a 12-lead ECG, which can take a lot of time for the techs to set up in the clinic workflow. It's important to note that these are not compatible with pacemakers or ICDs. And so here's just a quick summary of some of the devices I've talked about minus Whoop. And the point of this is to show that these devices are already very well studied in the literature. If you look at Fitbit, there are 612 studies on PubMed alone. And this was from a paper, I think, a couple of years ago already. 530 clinical trials and 40 cardiovascular clinical trials. The Apple Watch will catch up pretty soon. 135 studies on PubMed, 49 clinical trials, and 18 cardiovascular clinical trials. It's important to make note of what I think is the foundational piece of literature regarding how some trials will run both now and in the future with these smart devices. And this was in the New England Journal of Medicine, which was a large-scale assessment of a smartwatch to identify atrial fibrillation. And this looked at over 420,000 patients over 8 months, which is absolutely mind-blowing. There really aren't, without technology like this study would not be possible. And so this is the PPG device, as I mentioned. This is not the single lead. This is the PPG detecting heart rate variability, and whether or not it could detect atrial fibrillation. And so how this study worked is that if there was an irregularity detected, 4 more readings were taken once the user was at rest. And if the heart rate was still irregular, if the rhythm was still irregular, a notification was sent to the patient. A telemedicine visit was initiated and an ECG patch was mailed to wear for 7 days, again, comparing to a gold standard. And surveys were administered 90 days after the initial notification. And so the really cool thing and kind of mind-blowing thing about this study is that we had 420,000 patients to start. And these are patients without atrial fibrillation in their history. 2,100 over those 8 months received an irregular pulse notification, about 0.5%. 450 of those patients returned ECG patches, and atrial fibrillation was present in 34%. And at the end of the day, the positive predictive value for atrial fibrillation was 0.84 on an EKG patch with an irregular pulse notification. Those are concurring at the same time. And subsequent deep neural network training led to sensitivity and specificity of 98% and 90% respectively in pre-cardioversion patients. This is a more recent study and a quick plug for the pager. If you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it. It's a weekly email newsletter that summarizes all of the high yield, hard-hitting cardiology literature that was released that week, especially helpful around conference time, and also updates you with an image of the week and other news in medical devices and the world of cardiology beyond. Highly recommend it. And this is why I came across this study, which was the clinical validation of 5 direct-to-consumer wearable smart devices to detect atrial fibrillation. And so this study was done with 201 consecutive patients from a tertiary center cardiology service, and atrial fibrillation was present in 32% of those. And this looked at Apple, Samsung, Withings, Fitbit, and AliveCor. And at the end of the day, the Apple Watch had the highest sensitivity and specificity for detection of atrial fibrillation. And it's also interesting here that in all of these devices that range from 18 to 26% of inconclusive tracings based on the algorithm, but manual review of these tracings confirmed 99% of those inconclusive tracings. So this just goes to show that the algorithms are only going to get better and the sensitivity and specificity are only going to get higher. 85% sensitivity and 75% specificity is really solid for a wearable device. And so I've shown that decreased physical activity, increased heart rate, decreased heart rate variability all lead to increased mortality. So where do I see this going with these devices and this longitudinal data? Well, for me, what I can hope is that using this data from the Apple Watch, the Aura, and the Whoop device, we can combine an individual's data, their heart rate variability over the long term, and combine it with what we have for 10-year ASCVD risk assessments now, which is good, but again, based on a population of patients rather than the individual, him or herself. So I'm hopeful that with the individual data combined with the population data, we're going to be able to come up with better risk assessments for a truly individualized risk estimate for our patients in the future. Here's a list of the references for the first section. And as I mentioned, it was going to be our longest section today. So next I want to talk about sleep. And again, this is the infographic that the American Heart Association Essential 8 offers for sleep. And a lot of their advice has to do with limiting screens before bed, outside of the bedroom, and understanding how to prepare yourself for good sleep. And why do we care about sleep? Well, it turns out that inconsistent sleep patterns have been identified as a novel cardiovascular disease risk factor. And we're all familiar with the increased risk that sleep disordered breathing poses, obstructive sleep apnea. I'm not going to go through all the pathophysiologic mechanisms, but essentially obstructive sleep apnea here predicted a 2.4 increased risk in mortality and higher CVD incidence in 5,000 patients from the MESA cohort who were free of disease at baseline. 50% of OSA patients have hypertension, 30% of hypertensive patients will likely have OSA. And the prevalence of sleep disordered breathing is higher in patients with atrial fibrillation than others. And atrial fibrillation is harder to control in patients with sleep disordered breathing. But this is also important for patients that don't have obstructive sleep apnea. The non-obstructors, sleep matters. And so if you look at this upper left part of this graph, this is what good sleep looks like. This is consistent onset, consistent offset, consistent duration, day to day to day. Is that achievable? Not necessarily for me, but this is the ideal. And down here is an example of irregular or less healthy sleep patterns. And so what you can see is different onset, different offset throughout the week, a wide variety of duration. And ultimately, this data showed with 2,000 patients over 5-year follow-up that sleep duration and sleep onset timing are both really important in predicting cardiovascular disease. And so if you have the most irregular sleep patterns, you're at a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. If you have the highest variability of sleep onset timing, the most irregular sleep patterns, again, higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And so the devices I've talked about are all very similar in tracking the time of sleep, the sleep stages, restlessness, heart rate variability, and respirations. And just like for heart rate and heart rate variability, it's important to compare against the gold standard. And so this graph shows the comparison of these devices here, the Apple Watch, Oura, and Whoop, compared to the sleep study, the actual sleep study devices and technology that they use when they're looking for sleep apnea. And so you can see here the Apple Watch, as there's more sleep, the variability tightens. And not surprisingly, as I kind of mentioned before, Oura has been the industry leader in sleep tracking, but Whoop clearly matched it here. And so these two devices are commonly seen to be the best at tracking sleep, though all of these perform relatively well. Sleep Number is getting in the game as well. And I've talked about wearables up until this point, but this is a non-wearable. This is a mattress technology that is able to track all of that data without any wearable device. You lay on the mattress, you sleep or not, you wake up and you get this data on your phone. And so they've collected 10 billion hours of sleep data from 1.8 billion sleep sessions. And their 360 smart bed effortlessly adjusts throughout the night. This is, again, taken straight from their website. And they claim 28 more minutes of restful sleep per night, which is equating to 170 hours per year. And if you remember just back to that sleep study, more sleep duration, better cardiovascular disease outcomes. And they are also collaborating with Mayo Clinic to perform a wide variety of studies in a wide variety of patients. So bringing this close to home, this is actually my data from 2022. My wife and I bought the mattress back in, I think, June or July. And I had, this is where the good news is, average of 8 hours and 21 minutes, resting heart rate 66, thankfully below 70, respiratory rate of 18, and restful sleep of 7 hours and 42 minutes. I did achieve really good sleep one night. I wish I knew which night that was, and I'd try to replicate that. So I had 147 nights on the smart bed and 1,133 hours of restful sleep. But this is where the good news ends, in that I had 78 nights of the 147, just about half, where I met my sleep goal with the perfect amount of sleep to recover. I had about 2/3 of nights where I got enough restful sleep, but I really met my ideal schedule on only 24 of the 147 nights. So I guess I've got some room for improvement in 2023. I'm hoping that maybe after this whole fellowship thing, when I start a full-time job, it gets better, but I guess I'll find out in September. And so Sleep Number has a wide variety of offerings, and I was pleasantly surprised to find out that even their entry-level mattresses actually have this smart technology. So for $1,900, you can get a king bed, or you can spend $13,000 on the Climate 360 controlled heating and cooling smart bed. The choice is yours. The other hot, or I guess better, cold area of sleep temperature is actually controlling the sleep environment, as keeping skin temperature within tight range enhances deep sleep, which leads to improved heart rate and heart rate variability. And so 8 Sleep is the company that I'm featuring here, and they're building on the known marketing of 10,000 steps being a well-known metric, and sleep is the new 10,000 steps, so make it count. And you can sleep deeper while your pod adjusts the temperature to keep you asleep. And so what this is actually a mattress cover that has these tiny little water channels that go through it, and this water is cooled, that maintains the mattress and your sleeping environment at a precisely controlled window. And interestingly, this company decided to do a validation study with another smart wearable, an Oura. And so they had 300 patients wear Oura a month before and while using 8 Sleep. And they showed that deep sleep increased by 10%, HRV decreased by 6%. HRV increased by 6%, and heart rate decreased by 1%. And so all of that data led to the assumption that you're going to have better heart rate variability, you're going to have a lower heart rate, and that can actually lead to better sleep, which we know now leads to better cardiovascular outcomes. So this is a pretty expensive device. You're looking at $2,500 for the mattress cover alone. Or if you go for the entire mattress with the cover, it's a little bit more reasonable, but still pretty expensive at $3,700. So these next 2 sections I'm combining into managing weight and eating healthy. And the American Heart Association, I think, gives some of the most confusing messaging around eating and diet. That's a separate topic for discussion altogether. So I'm going to kind of breeze through that. And essentially, there is a scientific statement about obesity and cardiovascular disease. And we know that excess adiposity promotes changes in cardiac function directly through the effects on the myocardium and vasculature, and indirectly through obesity-related comorbidities. And again, it's a really complex pathophysiology, multi-organ system issue, as we all know. The good news, kind of like being able to improve your heart rate and heart rate variability, lifestyle modification, that million-dollar phrase, with associated weight loss improves the diagnostic components of metabolic syndrome and associated pathophysiologic abnormalities such as systemic inflammation and endothelial dysfunction. Again, based on where we are as a country now and the world going forward, this is a massive, massive opportunity and a massive problem that we need to address. And so this is just a quick example of a smart scale by a company called Withings. And this device not only tracks your weight, but it tracks your BMI, it tracks your body fat. It can even tell you the weather in the morning. And all of that feeds into the Withings app, which if you have either an Apple or Android, can then populate the data into your preferred health app of choice to track that data over time. This is super interesting. Not a whole lot of information out on it now, but this is a cardiac scale which claims to measure a broad spectrum of hemodynamic biomarkers to assess heart function and fluid status. So a special scale for our heart failure patients to step on to understand whether they're volume overloaded. So you could kind of compare this to a non-invasive CardioMEMS device. But moving forward to metabolism, or managing your weight and eating healthy, there's really only one device on the market now that aims to address the really large gap in understanding how people's metabolism works. And that's a device by a company called Lumen, and the device called Lumen. And so this is the first device to hack your metabolism by enhancing fat burn, losing weight, and boosting energy naturally. And this is actually a pretty simple device, as you can see here, blown up. There's a flow sensor, there's a circuit board, there's a CO2 sensor, a battery, and Bluetooth. And so essentially what you do is you hold this handheld device, take a deep breath in through it at a specific flow rate, which the phone app guides you through, and then you exhale. And what it does, it measures which metabolic fuels you're using, fats, carbs, or protein. And so this is done through the respiratory exchange ratio, which is the ratio between metabolic production of carbon dioxide and the uptake of oxygen. So if you're producing more carbon dioxide than you're uptaking oxygen, that means you're burning carbohydrates. Conversely, if you're producing less carbon dioxide than you're uptaking oxygen, you're burning fat. Somewhere in between is protein and a mix of fat and carbohydrate. So high CO2 means carb burn, low CO2 means fat burn. And again, important to compare these devices to the gold standard. And this was how the respiratory exchange ratio was measured previously, and now here with the Lumen device that you see here. And the data shows a pretty strong correlation between the Lumen expired CO2% and the respiratory exchange ratio with that more invasive measurement setting. And so the benefits of metabolic flexibility include natural weight loss, less snacking, energy and mood boost, improved overall health, and enhanced weight maintenance. And I think in addition to providing the data as to whether you're burning fat, burning carbs right away in the morning, this app actually also does a really good job in explaining what kind of things you should be thinking about eating that day, how to make your metabolism more flexible. And the data given here has been really strong and easy to understand in my experience. And this device is a yearly fee model where you're looking at $300 per year for the 12-month track. And if you want more attention, if you want more information, you can pay more, just like the other companies. And it's interesting too that this device is actually already being used in weight management clinics as a way to, as a touch point for somebody who's able to leave clinic, come back in a couple of weeks, come back in a month, come back in 3 months with data to talk about with their healthcare provider. And it'll be interesting going forward to the wide variety of research that will likely come from Lumen. And I'm really excited to see what they come up with next. So moving on to managing blood pressure, we know that hypertensive patients have higher all-cause, CVD-specific, and cerebro-specific mortality. I'm going to breeze through these really quickly. These are the most familiar to us after going through medical school, residency, fellowship, and beyond. And so I think we're all familiar with this data for the most part. And these are the 2017 hypertension guidelines. But the important thing here on the right is just to remind everybody that something so simple as taking a blood pressure is actually wildly complex. And these are the recommended steps to take in order to take an accurate blood pressure. And so things like verifying the use of the appropriate cuff size, avoid smoking, caffeinated beverage, or exercise within 30 minutes before blood pressure measurements. All those patients running late into clinic, huffing and puffing, not a great blood pressure measurement. You have to ensure greater than 5 minutes of quiet rest before blood pressure measurements. Probably not the easiest thing to do amidst the daily clinic workflow. And then sitting with your feet on the floor and legs uncrossed. Also kind of difficult to do unless you're actively paying attention to that at all times. So a quick aside here of something that maybe we're not as familiar with, and that's ambulatory blood pressure monitoring. And this chart is to show that when you're looking at 24 ambulatory blood pressure monitoring data, those numbers are a little bit more different than what we're accustomed to in the clinic data. And I think ambulatory blood pressure monitoring is still very underutilized, both in cardiology and in primary care, and actually gives really good data, better than clinic blood pressure monitoring and better than home-based blood pressure monitoring. And meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials have identified reductions in systolic and diastolic blood pressure and achievement of goals at 6 months and 1 year when self-monitoring of blood pressure has been used in conjunction with other interventions. So we can't do ambulatory blood pressure measurement all the time. Obviously, that's a really good place to start, but it is important to also note that home-based blood pressure monitoring can also be a really useful tool. And this particular website, I just feature this here, is a great resource to use when you're talking to patients about what blood pressure cuff they should get at home. When you tell a patient, at least have some sort of brand in mind. And this is just one snapshot of a company called Omron that is very well respected, very well validated, and highly recommended by this educational trust. So that's the company that I recommend to my patients. And again, going back to the ABPM data, this provided a better method to predict long-term CVD outcomes than did office blood pressures. And similarly, new data is showing that home-based blood pressure monitoring is actually similar. And to refresh everybody as to how this works, the ambulatory blood pressure monitor, worn for 24 hours, goes off every 15 to 30 minutes during the day and 15 to 60 minutes at night. Measures the mean blood pressure, day and night, and nocturnal dipping, early morning blood pressure surge, and symptomatic hypotension. And the interesting thing is that these devices are paid for, but very underutilized. So while they were reimbursed at a median of $52 between 2007 and 2010, they're also very easy to read, by the way. Only less than 1% of beneficiaries were submitted for reimbursement. It's always covered. You can talk about masked hypertension. If blood pressure is normal in clinic and not normal at home, white coat hypertension, which we're more familiar with, is the opposite. And of course, response to treatment as well. All indications that are all covered by Medicare. So here's an example of 3 different offerings from Omron, ranging from affordable to a little bit more expensive. And when you get into the more expensive range, that's typically when it interfaces with a phone and with an app on your phone. So managing diabetes, and we know well that diabetes is independently associated with all-cause and CVD mortality, even after adjusting for other CVD risk factors. And continuous glucose monitors, a little bit out of scope from a cardiology standpoint, but we really should be offering this to diabetes management in adults with multiple daily injections or insulin pumps. Again, out of scope of our practice, but something to at least mention to our patients if they haven't considered that with their doctors. There's clear data for these with type 1 diabetes, murky for type 2. I'm going to leave it at that. But here's the interesting part that some of you may have seen more recently, and that these continuous glucose monitors are kind of used by the biohackers or people without diabetes. And some preliminary data has shown that higher glucose variability throughout the day increases CVD, CVD death, Alzheimer's, frailty, cancer death, and all-cause mortality. And at the end of the day, today's normal patient is tomorrow's diabetic. But at this time, these are pretty significantly cost prohibitive in the multiple hundreds of dollars per month. So managing cholesterol. Basic infographic here from the Essential 8 on the left. And the portion that I really want to highlight here, which kind of applies to everything we do from a medication intervention in cardiology, is taking medication as directed. That's not easy. It turns out that medication non-adherence contributes yearly to approximately 125,000 preventable deaths. So that's a problem. 50% of cardiovascular disease patients consistently take their medications, but this is a really difficult problem to assess. And because it's difficult to assess, it remains undermanaged. And interestingly, in the more recent ischemia trial, 25% of patients randomized to the medication management arm reported non-adherence, 25% self-reported non-adherence in one of the most crucial trials between invasive and non-invasive management of coronary disease. And so there have been state-of-the-art reviews as to really just bring attention to improving medication adherence as being a crucial initiative in cardiometabolic disease. And it's important to lay out the complex factors that influence medication adherence: socioeconomic factors, healthcare system-related factors, illness, therapy-related factors, and patient-related factors. And this particular review article identified ways to substantially reduce non-adherence, identify monitoring methods, improve the evidence base to better understand adherence, develop patient and health provider, team-based engagement strategies, and alleviate health disparities. And enter Dose Health. This is the company that I mentioned before that a colleague of mine in medical school, a family friend, and I started actually back in medical school. And so rather than talk you through what this company does, I'm going to show you.
Introducing Dose Health. We have created a smart pill box that deeply integrates with intelligent software, making it a powerful adherence tool. After a brief setup, the device knows which medications and what times they need to be taken. When it is time, the device's internal tray rotates to reveal the correct pills. An alarm will sound to let the patient know it is time to take their meds. If a patient is late in taking their pills, text and email alerts can be set up to notify a caregiver. Taking the pills is as simple as turning the device over. And when the device is empty, a simple guide will walk you through filling the easily removable tray. Dose Health also provides crucial tracking data to help facilities and home care institutions improve the care they give. All of this in a small, affordable package. Dose Health, because every dose matters.
So thus far, we have about 3.6 million tracked dispenses. 150,000 of those dispenses have been missed, and that's a 96% adherence rate. Pretty impressive improvement from the 50% reported in the literature. Our device is covered by the Medicaid Waiver Service Program in these 8 states listed here, with more to come hopefully soon. We have just over 4,100 clients. It's probably up past 4,200 now, and 6,500 devices out. We've partnered with different organizations throughout the state of Minnesota and outside in other states. And our device or devices $60 per month, which includes 2 of these dose flips and the health reminders that you heard, any adaptive equipment depending on different arthritis or other disabilities, and notifications for caregivers. And so when you look at Dose Health and you look at the ways that this review article mentioned to reduce non-adherence, this is clearly a monitoring method. We can improve the evidence base to better understand adherence when we're able to track this data in real time and over the longitudinal long-term time frame. With this data and with this information, if I see somebody in my clinic and I understand that they have a 60% adherence rate, then I'm able to start to talk about, well, why is this happening? Is it side effects? Is it something else that's limiting you? Or at the same time, if they're 95% adherent and we're still not at goal for guideline-directed medical therapy, that's a good time to increase said therapy. And alleviating health disparities is important, which is why we're covered by the Medicaid waiver program in the 8 states that we are in so far. Last but not least, smoking cessation. And it's kind of a shame that this is the final topic that we're going to cover tonight, because I feel like smoking cessation just really always gets overlooked, but it's the most preventable cause of death in the United States. And despite us making progress as a nation, we still clearly have some more work to do. And it's not just about the nation and not just about the whole population. It's that individual patient sitting in front of me in clinic that says they've smoked a pack a day for the past 30 years. Well, how can we change that? And a little reminder about nicotine cessation, and this is the different cessation methods that you're probably familiar with. Some medications here, but the nicotine patch, nicotine inhaler, nicotine gum. But the important thing to note here is that combination therapy is actually the most effective smoking cessation strategy. So I would highly encourage you to talk to patients about not just using the patch, not just using the gum, but to use them in conjunction. And be sure to talk to your patients too about how to properly use these things. It's not like chewing gum. You chew and you pocket it. Same with the lozenge. And think about the patch as the long-term baseline nicotine and the gum or the lozenges for those acute cravings. So again, all of these combination methods are stronger than any of these individual methods. So nicotine is part of the problem. That's the actual medical addiction standpoint, but habit is the other part that can be equally, if not harder, to break for some patients. And so this device, which I think is the most unique device that I'll talk about today, Pavlok, aims to address this problem among other addiction pathophysiologies.
More than 40% of our lives are spent in habit. For most of us, that time is wasted. The secret to transformation is not to try harder. It's to replace bad habits with the habits of excellence. If you wanted to transform yourself, how would you start? First, Identify the habits that hold you back. Pair them with a negative stimulus like electric shock. Each surge of voltage trains your brain and weakens the neural connection until the bad habit is severed. Next, replace the bad habit with a positive one. Reward yourself when you complete your daily goal. Commit to a penalty if you fail. The fear of loss stimulates your basal ganglia, while the chance of reward motivates your prefrontal cortex. In fewer than 30 days, the action becomes a habit. Pavlok is the first system designed to help you build good habits and break bad ones. Earn rewards when you succeed, pay the price when you fail, and experience the electric shock that keeps you on track.
So this device is actually based on data from long, long ago in Pavlovian conditioning. And it's important to remember that we are animals too, and our brains can be rewired to negative and positive stimuli as well. And so the whole point of Pavlok is to associate habit with negative stimulus. And then our brain is naturally rewired to stop liking the habit. And this is actually a study from 1988 that looked at long-term outcomes of clients treated in a commercial stop smoking program. And so this is 832 patients, 55% were male, and there were 3 phases. The first phase included kind of a ramp up interview process. The second phase is where the therapy happened. And every day for a week, patients presented to this clinic. And in this clinic, they were placed in an old school phone booth. And that old school phone booth was filled with old cigarette ash, ashtrays, cigarette butts, just absolutely disgusting environment. And they had a full chest shock therapy system where they brought a pack of cigarettes into that disgusting phone booth. They would open the pack of cigarettes. The experiment controls would shock them. They would take the cigarette out, shock, put it up to their lips, shock, take a puff, shock, and repeat for the duration of the session, which was an hour long, every day for a week. And then there was follow-up, which included phone conversations, small group things, nothing all that intensive. And so over the 13-month follow-up, 52% remained smoke-free and 30% were smoking less. And really the main reason as to why people did not end up quitting is because they live with another smoker. So all of this may seem like a Saturday Night Live skit, but aversion therapy is very real and has been really well studied for many years. And so 35 years later, enter Pavlok in the University of Massachusetts. This is a very small study, but more studies are ongoing. And this was 8 people who smoked 10 to 20 cigarettes per day. And this study was designed for a shock with every puff of cigarette for 2 weeks, as well as social support. 6 completely stopped, 3/4 completely stopped. That is wildly more effective than any other particular therapy we have available today. The other 2 cut down by over half, and that's huge. And so when patients come back to clinic and say, oh, I'm not smoking a full pack a day, I'm smoking a half a pack a day, that's a big deal. And so further studies are underway, and they're hoping for FDA clearance and further clinical trials. So the Pavlok here, as you can see, is $220, and you can rent it actually for $30 per month, which comes with these challenges that leads to accountability and actually rewards depending on whether or not you're able to complete these challenges. And so with all these devices, there are concerns. Device accuracy, of course, is a concern. Inaccurate data is more harmful than no data. We don't want to create digital overdiagnosis. We really need standards by medical societies to evaluate these devices, and we need uniform regulatory policies too. We need to be able to separate the actionable data from the noise. We need to develop meaningful use criteria. We need to integrate this data into our clinics, into our daily practice. We need more of these randomized control trials with long-term follow-up, and there's one underway actually with the Apple Watch as we speak. And we need a telehealth curriculum. We need to learn what kind of data these devices produce and how we should use it in our day-to-day routine with patients and in our own lives. Patient privacy is a whole nother topic altogether that could take another hour, but data de-identification is really important, updating HIPAA, and really making sure that patients opt in to sharing their data rather than having to opt out. Cost is another major factor. We need to make sure that a new health disparity does not arise. And already we can see a 3-fold use difference between high and low socioeconomic status in these devices. understandably, given they range from a $30 blood pressure cuff to a $13,000 mattress. That's something really important to keep our eyes on as well. And just for the entry level of all the devices I talked about today, we're looking at $2,500 upfront buy-in. That is quite expensive for many of our patients. And so what do I see about the future? I want to wrap things up here and peer into a crystal ball and attempt to predict what we see. And I see a clinic. Maybe it's a full building. Maybe it's just a room within an existing clinic. And maybe it's not a clinic at all. Maybe it's a virtual clinic. And this clinic will teach patients how to use these devices, collect actionable data from a pill box, safe but effective shock therapy, blood pressure monitor, Apple Watch, Lumen, Aura, Smart Scale, Whoop, and continuous diabetes monitoring. Maybe this is some wild fantasy, but I really do doubt it. And all these devices will lead to better, more individualized care for our patients with truly actionable data. And if we don't take charge as physicians, if we don't spearhead this future, we don't understand what's out there now and what's coming down the pipeline, I'm really afraid that we're going to be left behind. And our patients truly deserve better. And I think that we can work together with industry and building on Life's Essential 8, we can create a better future both for our patients and for ourselves. Thank you. And this was, I want to thank Shelby and the rest of the ACC Minnesota chapter for this opportunity. Really excited to get in front of this audience. I've given this talk a few times now, and it's either been community-based or to kind of general cardiology practitioners. So I'm really excited to hear what the younger generation of providers thinks. And I really want to hear feedback from everybody. So feel free to email me, digitalhealthmd@gmail.com. I'm going to start a monthly newsletter as well, talking about these devices and the data they produce. Or feel free to reach out on Twitter as well. Really love to hear not only feedback about this talk, but ideas that you all may have and things you've experienced with these devices so far. And so with that, I'll give a few minutes for questions if there are any, but please feel free to reach out if you think of anything.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Jensen. So while we're waiting to see if anyone has questions, I'm just going to pop the flyer in the chat for our Y Cardiology event that's happening this Saturday. So it's really open to any, I think we've got med students, residents, and fellows, but that includes like undergraduates, kind of any level. So if you happen to know anyone in your life, go ahead and share that. I don't see any questions, so I think, Dr. Jensen, if you're ready to sign up, I think we can call it a night. But oh, it looks like we might have a raised hand. Let me see if I can unmute here. Here we go.
Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Jensen. Great presentation. I have a few questions to ask. So the first one is, can PPG be falsely low or elevated in patients with atherosclerotic disease, causing inaccuracies in measurement of heart rate variability? This is considering stiff arteries or extensive plaque. The second one is, does measurement of PPG have a racial bias, in turn creating bias in measuring heart rate variability? And are there any studies depicting racial or disease bias? The third one is, can PPG be used to identify different diseases like sickle cell or other hemoglobinopathies? And my last question is, do you think creating a fellowship integrating cardiology and innovation is a path forward for fellows in training to learn more about devices, telehealth, coding, and algorithms?
Yeah, so those are great questions, and I wish I had better answers to them. And just to clarify, when you mean PPG, you mean the type of technology to detect heart rate and heart rate variability?
Yes, the photoplethysmography that you
Yes.
described. Yes.
Yes, and so I am not aware of any literature that looks at specifically the the racial biases, and you're referring to darker skin versus lighter skin. Is that correct?
Correct.
And so that is something I can certainly look more into. I did not come across any of that in preparation for this talk, and would love if you can send me an email. I will follow up with that. Absolutely. I think that's an
Sure.
excellent question. From the fellowship standpoint or further learning, I know there are companies out there that are offering positions to either people just outside of residency or outside of fellowship to explore things like this. And of course, a lot of it takes place on the West Coast. So I think in this case too, because things happen so quickly, it actually is best to partner with industry in this rather than create an educational fellowship, because by the time you're done studying it, like things are happening so fast. So like I said, I don't know the companies offhand at this moment, but working with industry in less of a fellowship position, but more of a real world experience position for a year or two, I think would be the most valuable to learn on the job, so to speak.
And I'm a PGY2 in internal medicine, and I'm actually applying for a cardiology fellowship. And I do have a background in biomedical informatics, data analysis, and some degree of AI and ML. So what you spoke about today was really informative and was something that I was able to grasp pretty easily, and something that I would like to use in my clinical practice as well. So I appreciate you taking the time off to give us this talk.
That's fantastic. Appreciate it. Thank you. Sounds like you've got a really strong background to make some waves. I'm excited to see what you do. But yeah, please reach out via email or on
Sure.
Twitter. Would love to chat further.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, I think if that's all, I'm going to say thank you so much again to Dr. Jensen, and we'll sign off for the night. Thank you.
Thank you.